Hey there, I'm Chris Kroll, editor-in-chief of Solar Builder magazine, and domestic content is one of the most important topics in the solar industry. But what do solar contractors need to know about it right now? Today on Power Forward, we're going to try and discuss domestic content as in-depth as we can with David Dunlap, VP of Product Strategy at BayWa RE. Hey, David, how are you doing today?
Hey, Chris, great to be here. How are you?
I'm doing well, trying to, there's a lot of stuff we're going to try to cover today. So let's not waste any time. Like the Trump administration, we're just going to do as much as we can all at once. So before we get into those weeds, I'm just curious right off the top, if anything that in this initial push of kind of the anti-Green New Deal executive orders, does that change any of this conversation, render any of it moot? Are tax credit adders potentially impacted at all from what you're hearing going forward?
It's a great question. I know it's on everyone's mind. I think the simple answer is we don't know yet, but we think that 2025 tax year is largely intact. I think that there are definitely some indicators of where future funding and programs may be at risk. And I think we're all right to be watching it really closely. But from what I'm hearing from SIA and news outlets and stuff that are sort of tapped into the DC advocacy for our industry, so far so good. They're looking at longer term or unallocated dollars for the most part. So tax credits and things that are actually on the books as law, changing that process is a much more lengthy endeavor.
Yeah, and I do think, regardless of maybe what happens with the tinkering of the tax credits, the focus on domestic content seems like it's going to be important kind of no matter what, based off of the government's interest in tariffs, right? And just kind of in generally doing things here, right? So
100%. Yeah, I think that's the big message is that we are going to be a more USA manufactured solar industry without question. And there is a huge push for kind of that protectionist view and bring manufacturing and jobs and sort of protect our own internal economy. Really, the question is, can we be competitive enough, fast enough to maintain momentum and be relevant? I think that's the challenge. But yeah, everything that the new administration is doing is to pretty much force manufacturing to occur within our borders.
So we're not going to necessarily get into the crystal ball of how all this might impact how much more manufacturing is coming on board necessarily, but so where we sit right now, can you sum up the landscape of domestic manufacturing relevant to our universe of residential and commercial solar installers in terms of module availability, inverters, racking, batteries? Just set the stage here.
I'll do my best. So across the categories, yes, there's been some significant investment in the past few years moving in this direction, but it's not complete and certainly not giving the breadth of choice in terms of manufacturers or product technologies that exists on the global stage. So we know that Enphase and SolarEdge started down this path much earlier than anybody else, and so they're the ones that are going to be in the limelight and basically enjoy the market demand prominence by being first to market, and that kind of fits with their position in the U.S. market anyway. So I think that's pretty much a given. Outside of those two, it remains to be seen who I think the next meaningful player might be. Obviously, Tesla already manufactures a lot of their product in the US, but it's a global company and they've worked really hard to have the benefits of offshore manufacturing at different stages of the production and the supply chain. So we'll see if they're the next one, and if so, then who comes after that remains to be seen. Racking, I think, because of the way that the safe harbor table kind of turned the tide against the modules, in favor of inverters and racking as a path, last year in the May guidance. I think all the racking companies really jumped on that opportunity and said that let's spin this up, let's make it happen. So I think the delta between manufacturing a lot of the aluminum products versus importing offshore, maybe the gap wasn't as big as with other categories, or the skill set requirement wasn't as large of a gap. But at any rate, I think the opportunity to replace imports with domestic is maybe greater. So we're seeing pretty much all of the major racking companies have offerings, and they're just kind of working through all the different components and trying to line it up with where they think they fall in the overall domestic content tax credit demand channels, I guess is a way to say it. So I think those two are fairly solid. I think that modules, we've really got 3 or 4 primary players that are ahead of the curve in terms of road mapping to having domestic cell manufacturing, but we've got a lot more than that that have US factories for assembly. And so then it just becomes a question of how much of the component products they can source domestically, and somewhere in that 3% to 12-13% range, we probably could have a lot of opportunity within that if it became a mandate, for example. Right now, it's still what makes sense in terms of the cost benefit, who the customer is. And so you've got really Q-cells, SIL-FAB, Sirius PV are at the forefront of supporting the residential, the TPO part of this market, and very few that are supporting it on the commercial side, because the way that the guidance changed is sort of, I think there's a disconnect, and we'll get into that maybe later in more detail. But I think modules is a little tricky when you're talking about really where all of this started and the drive to have a full domestic content module, wafer cells, and all the assembly and the components. That's still years out in terms of the capability here in the US. And then storage, lastly, on the batteries, that's a tough one. We just don't have the infrastructure and the supply chain to do full battery manufacturing in the US. I think it's just going to take years to get there with enough volume and enough players. But we're seeing the top players, Enphase, SolarEdge, Tesla, all are moving towards having, Franklin, don't want to leave them out, definitely all have roadmaps to domestic content cell and cell pack manufacturing within this year.
You started to allude to the next part of the discussion here. Treasury released additional guidance for the domestic content tax credit, altering the cost percentages from the May safe harbor tables to an updated 2025 version. And the big change in this 2025 version of the safe harbor cost percentage table is the column for modules that include wafers that are sourced domestically. And there's a lot to get into here, but first, broadly, what jumped out at you in the updated table compared to the 2024 safe harbor domestic guidance table?
You're right. The big difference of noticing that now there's 2 columns, one for wafer, one for cell, looks dramatic. But if you really dig into it, what's going on there is you still get to count a % contribution for a cell that was made from an imported wafer, but it's a lower amount than if you have the wafer plus cell. And what's not an option is to have a domestic wafer manufacturing and then send that wafer to Indonesia or someplace and then make it into a cell and then bring it back and put it into the module. That's not going to get you any contribution. So it's kind of just lining up that whole supply chain, trying to get wafer, cell, and module all being done here in the US. That's kind of the point. And if you look at the difference between the wafer column and the cell column, it's like 4 or 5%. It's not detrimental. It doesn't mean that you don't get to count a domestic cell without the domestic wafer manufacturing being part of it. It's just that you get a bigger bump if the wafer is also included. And the CEA has talked about this a few times. They've been on a few webinars where they've really done a great job of demonstrating the amount of investment, effort, time, and cost to set up new manufacturing in the US for each of these component stages is incrementally harder and more expensive the further up the chain you go, right? So ingot pulling, wafer cutting and manufacturing, cell manufacturing, each one of those has a longer time frame and a higher cost and a longer ROI to stand that up. So this is a long-term play, not a short-term, oh, somebody's going to spin this up in the next 6 months. Not going to happen.
Yeah. And so I wanted to jump in there. Right now, is there even U.S. wafer manufacturing?
Not presently, no. But Q-cells and JA Solar are both working on it.
Okay. And then when you look at the percentages, like you said, the differences aren't crazy between the two tables. I don't know. Does that seem like enough of an incentive to even, like you said, make the investment to manufacture the wafers here when you could just use the first column with just cells and still have, and get your inverters and racking and pretty much still qualify for the domestic content tax credit adder? Like what, you don't get extra incentive to
Right.
source it with a wafer, right? Like what's the point?
Right. No, I think the part that is not captured in the guidance or the safe harbor table is what is the actual investment cost and the return on that investment at each stage. And you can think about that ROI the same for a tax entity investing in their solar project and the value of that 10% adder compared to the higher cost of the equipment going in. So we can say, that wafer isn't worth that much more, but if it costs 20 cents a watt more to get a domestic wafer cell into a module, that may overwhelm the benefit on the back end of the tax credit. So that's the simple math that most of the developers are doing right now, and the installers and the manufacturers are doing to say, is this worthwhile? And when you look at the news, several months old now, but the Meyer Burger decided not to go ahead with their Colorado Springs cell manufacturing investment. And then more recently, the partnership with Haleen to do cell manufacturing with their domestic company manufacturer, that's been put on hold because of the uncertainty of the long-term viability and return on this. What they're doing is they're looking at what is that additional cost of putting a domestic cell, whether it has a wafer or not, into a module, and then does that increase the net total balance, right, of investment and economic return, inclusive of the tax credit. And if that doesn't pencil out, people are just going to not choose to do it. So there's a difference here between creating a path and an incentive to do it with some cash benefit. There's a limit. Like if I have to spend $5 to make $1, I'm not going to do it, versus a mandate, right? And that's what we might be facing further out in terms of potential changes to the law. If the current administration believes that we just need to make sure that everyone is using domestically manufactured solar equipment, then it's no longer about cost to make the decision. It's, I have to make this decision. Now I have to restructure my ROI and my thinking, and right. And if all the incentives go away, then it just is a higher cost of business, right? And that will ultimately, that mandate, it doesn't mean that people are making money on this, but they're forced to do it. So that's the choice. So now, instead of my equipment bomb costing whatever the national average is now 85 cents, it's $1.25. And now that's the new reality. So everything else just has to adjust to that. Right now, it's all about how much more do I have to spend, keep that as small as possible to unlock this bigger credit on the back end. And as long as that's a net positive after the credit, then I'm interested in doing it.
And so let's move into that kind of smaller scale part of things for a second. Looking at the safe harbor tables, they tweaked the cost percentages for some of the other components compared to the 2024 table, where it looked pretty easy to qualify for the domestic content tax credit adder with just MLPE in racking without a module. I mean, it was like a kind of a no-brainer. Then that percentage went from 60% to around 44.5% without a module with an MLPE-based rooftop racking system, right? A string inverter system now under the new percentages would need a domestic module to hit the 40% benchmark. That is on my reading of it. I'm wondering, when you're looking at the tables, not thinking of kind of the broader global supply chain implications, what are meaningful changes that stood out to you, and what are you hearing from, kind of your customers?
This is a fun one for me because I happen to have kind of a math brain, and I like math, and I know I find myself saying a lot of times people don't do math. But if you talk to any of the module companies, they will say that the May table was just out of whack, that it was almost like Treasury didn't do the right math to come up with those percentages. And so now most of the module companies say, yeah, this is more accurate. This is more reflective of what average system costs are for each of the components. And the previous guidance was just wrong from a math model standpoint. if you talk to the racking and the inverter companies, they'll say, yeah, now it's harder. Now we need to link arms with a module company, or, it's not quite so simple to just have a clean, 2 or 3 SKU solution. But I think at the end of the day, they would also agree that it's probably more accurate to the true cost. And remember, the safe harbor table came about as a way to kind of bulk approve these equipment BOMs rather than take the direct cost method, which was outlined in the original law and was the only path. It was designed for large scale commercial and utility projects where you could feasibly say, here's all the equipment, here's the exact manufacturer cost of each of the components, do the math for that one project and make that submittal to Treasury and prove your tax credit. When people started looking at scaling this and making it available for smaller C&I, 50 projects in a year kind of a thing, rather than 1 or 2, and then they started looking at the TPO financed opportunities where they could have a standard package that could be repeated 10,000 times. The safe harbor table became a real opportunity to say, there's a sort of a default pre-approved package here that we can say, as long as you meet these guidelines, you're in, not having to go through all of that proof point and detailed behind the curtain cost factors from every component supplier. The table has to reflect the direct cost method at some level. It's not meant to bypass that or say this component is worth 5 times the amount that it actually is in the market. That would be wrong. So getting it right was super important. I think because there were so many months in between the two guidance and so many people, companies, manufacturers, as well as the installers started to act on that May guidance, that now we're really just suffering from the change management. That's unfortunate, but it's just the reality of how these things get done. And I say every time I get a chance to talk about this, it's still not final, folks. These are guideline updates, is updated guidance is what they say. And it's the best information we have until it's changed or until it's finalized.
How long can I still use the guidance from that 2024 table?
It's written into the update in the January update. So if you go to the IRS site and look at the guidance, you can pour through the legal speak and get there. But it's basically the date of effectiveness of the new guidance, which I believe was January 16th. There's a 90-day grace period. So that puts it to April 13th or 14th, something like that. You're allowed to use the prior guidance. You've got a 90-day grace period to adjust to the new guidance. What constitutes the start of a project under that or within that 90-day grace period is also not exactly clear. It's really clear if you're completing a project and you've got commissioning during that prior to April 13th, that's really clear and obvious and easy. If it's you made a safe harbor investment of at least 5% of the cost of the product for the projects, I believe that also will count. So there's ways that you can do that if you are in fact the one who is going to prove the content and the compliance under that. And again, I have to I guess put my typical disclaimer in here. I'm not a tax attorney. Everyone who's looking at this guidance needs to have a tax attorney that they're working with to get the ultimate final answers about what to do. And again, have to call out the difference between a commercial project where you maybe are working directly with the tax entity as an installer, advising them on how to have a successful project here, versus a residential installer selling a finance product where the TPO is a tax entity. You just need to default to what the TPO is telling you to do. You shouldn't be making any of these decisions on your own.
Another notable change in the 2025 guidance was, it seems like you are no longer able to aggregate the storage part of a solar plus storage system into the domestic content equation, right? You have to do the solar percentage cost equation and then the storage cost equation, which would hurt a solar plus storage system's overall, aggregate. It was easier in aggregate to meet the percentages. Am I right about that?
Yeah, so I'll confess I'm not 100% up to date on exactly how to explain the difference, the nuance here in this change, but you're right. There is a change between the May guidance and now the new January 25 guidance. It has to do with the definition of a project versus a facility. And there's this tech neutral law or clause in those definitions. But the simplest way to explain it is as you just said. Previously, that difference wasn't really clear, and so it seemed like you could do a solar plus storage, and if you counted on either one of them to get to the 40% threshold, then the entire project was sort of accepted and all counted and contributed. Now, under the definition of the tech neutral clause and facility versus project, if it's you do have to look at it as the PV side versus the storage side, and each one has its own path for full compliance. And that obviously brings up some fundamental questions about if you've got an inverter, hybrid inverter in the system that is both part of the PV project side of the project and also part of the storage, where do you can't count them in both. So you have to pick one or the other. And that's exactly what people are struggling with is if I pick the inverter in the Powerwall 3 as part of the storage, that's makes sense because it's embedded in the battery. The battery is what's getting the full contribution of domestic content. And so then the storage meets the threshold. But then over on the PV side, not only can you not count the inverter because you already counted it on the storage side, but even if you could, what if that inverter doesn't have domestic content contribution? You're still looking at on the PV table, the string solution where racking is only 24.5% contribution if you've got full domestic racking. And then what else? There is nothing else. Like you need a module that's 15.6% and that doesn't exist. So you basically are saying you're not going to be able to count any of the PV towards the tax credit. And so therefore, it's not that you don't earn the tax rebate, but you only earn it on the storage portion of the project.
One other clarification I wanted to understand is, I guess I was looking for, I kept hearing that, the original law it had the 5% annual kind of step up in the cost percentage. So from 40 to 45 in 2025 and so on. But the initial law only wrote it for the PTC and not the ITC. And so I just kept hearing like, oh, that's going to be updated or clarified that, yes, this does apply to the ITC, but that still was not mentioned. And should I just forget about that? Should I just, we all assume that it applies to the ITC? And
yeah, it's another one of those cases where we're all sort of looking to the guidance and the law to tell us what to do. And it's not, in some ways, it's not telling us what to do because we're expecting it to tell us that it's changing its mind, but it isn't. So the truth is the ITC is flat at 40%. It didn't change from 24 to 25. That's the current state under the current guidance because the original law has not yet been updated or changed. I think what a lot of the sort of boots on the ground consensus is, we still don't believe that it won't change in the future. So in order to be safe, we should come up with a menu, right, or a package that gets to 45.1% that we can be counting on just in case, right? So that's a good idea, but it also means you're complicating the math, and you've got to maybe find a module now that has a partial commitment to combine with your Enphase or SolarEdge with domestic racking to get to that 45.1% threshold. That's fine. That's just basically a commercial decision around how do I hedge my bets, right? And make sure that this project is going to be compliant by the time I get it installed and by the time whoever the tax entity is goes and files for their taxes. So I think that's the consensus, is that nobody really believes it's going to stay at 40% forever. As soon as we start looking 2026, 2027, 2028, I think then you get back to our first point, first question and topic was, are those laws going to change further out in time? I'm betting yes, they will change at some point. Most likely, the long runway that we thought we had for protection on the ITC is going to get pulled back. Again, these things take time to implement. Manufacturing doesn't happen overnight. And decisions we make now do have an impact in 9 months, 12 months, 18 months down the road. So we're betting on this, betting on the laws. And so, what's your comfort level at the craps table? Where do you want to put your money?
Right. Laws. I think I remember those. So if domestic content matters to my business, how can I ensure that I'm able to, procure what's available? I assume demand is kind of crazy right now with everyone kind of going for certain brands and what's available. There's only so much capacity. So kind of stepping back, everything we've talked about, I guess, how is this affecting the market in terms of pricing, availability, and how are you maybe advising, your customers?
You would think that with the amount of attention, the amount of conversation, the amount of press that we have around domestic content, that demand would be crazy. And I think honestly, it's not as crazy as people say it is, or that they thought it might be. I think you've got pockets of high demand for certain products. Enphase, I guess, as the top inverter market share brand, and the obvious easy solution for installers who already installed Enphase, they just buy a slightly different SKU. They're compliant under the prior guidance, right? They buy a domestic rail instead of a non-domestic rail. Their package is done. That was super easy. So demand for certain things was spiking in those areas where those are attached to Sunnova lease sales, because Sunnova was the first one to market to say, it's not just a choice, it's a mandate. We're all in with this. But then you look at Sunnova's market share. That's not a dominant amount of all solar systems sold in residential today, right? So it's a slice of that market, and there's very few other TPO finance companies that have come to market yet with their full, here's how we're going to do this, here's the AVL, here's the menu package, and what it's moving, it's getting to that point. We've got LightReach has entered the space, and there's a couple other, Sunrun and others, that are really close to getting there, and they're starting to talk to the installers about, hey, you're going to need to buy, this is the stuff that you're going to. But I don't believe that all of these other companies are going to make it a mandate the way Sunnova did. I think they're going to say, here's a domestic lease product with this price and this incentive and this cost structure included, and here's this non-domestic package. So choose, which one do you want to do? So again, it's not that the entire market is beholden to these finance products. There are loans, there's still cash, there's non-domestic lease options out there. None of those need to worry about domestic content because there's no direct benefit for any of the players in those spaces. On the commercial side, you'd think, again, if it was super easy to get this tax credit, everyone would be doing it. The truth is, it's not super easy to get it. It's not always penciling out. Some of the contractors are worried that they're committing a contract 6, 12, maybe 18 months before they can actually do the installation. They're worried about the rules changing. And we just saw the rules change right out from under somebody. So if they were selling a job last October under the May guidance, but it's not going to start until July, are they going to still be able to provide the same package that they sold back last year? Maybe not, right? The rules have changed by the time they get to it. So now they're looking at, do I preserve that project with getting that 5% safe harbor initiation or some other way of getting it captured under the prior guidance? Or do I adjust the contract and now I've got to buy something else or make a different combination? And we're seeing some commercial contractors are saying, it's a lot of work. It is added cost, it's added complexity, it's added risk. I'm just not going to do it.
That's exactly what I wondered about, is for all this that I've been, just at my desk poring over this stuff, trying to, I don't have a legal degree, I don't have a tax background, I don't have a math brain like you do. I'm trying to understand this and crunch numbers and talking to manufacturers and just so in the weeds on this. And it's just to your point, out there in the real world is maybe it's just better to focus on, not worry about this and focus on what you normally do, the products that are available, and being quicker to get a deal done that you can feel confident in, or at least the most confident you can be in this environment, and just going with that. And so it sounds like you're seeing that maybe there's just an advantage for contractors who are maybe somewhat ignoring this right now, or not, at least not hanging their hopes on the domestic content tax credit as a part of way of getting a deal done, I guess.
Yeah, I think my advice to our listeners, to any installer faced with this choice, is know your business and know what you're good at and what you're willing, what your risk tolerance is. The truth is there's a lot of pressure to make an offer to provide that tax credit benefit to your customer, right? And so the first step is making sure that you understand who that customer is and are they actually the one that's going to be benefiting from the tax credit? Because you as the installer are not. It's not yours to give out. It's yours to meet compliance. But if you sign a contract that says you guarantee they will get it, you're, in my mind, foolish. What you can sign a contract for is an intention to provide domestic compliant product in consultation with them and with manufacturers to ideally, hopefully achieve that. But if you're guaranteeing it, you're putting your business on the line because you can't guarantee it. It really does boil down to how confident are you in your business, in your ability to navigate this process, and how much do you believe you're going to need to compete against other contractors who are potentially looking at the same project with the same owner who says, I want to work with someone who's going to get me this tax credit. You've got a choice as an installer. You can say, that's not me, thanks, I'll go talk to someone else. Or you can say, I'm interested in your job, but I might want to challenge your assumption that that's the thing that's going to be the best bet for you. Let's do some math. Let's run some scenarios. And if I can demonstrate to you that I can give you a project for less investment without the tax credit than for a higher upfront cost with the tax credit risk, maybe you still want to work with me.
Wherever these products come from, after they get here, U.S. people take them and install them on U.S. homes and businesses, and they continue to have people go and maintain those systems. And it's a long-term actual economy in itself, you know. So I feel like sometimes we maybe worry a little bit too much about where these things were created and not much about all the how it impacts so many people from there on, right? You know, it's still a U.S. industry in itself after it all gets here. Anyway, David, thank you for sharing your brain and your knowledge and all in market insights and all that good stuff with us on Power Forward today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.